Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was New Year's Day, and Mark was looking forward to a quiet day after a long night of celebrating with friends. He had stayed up until the early hours, ringing in the new year at a local bar, and now he was exhausted. As he drove home through the empty streets, the fog from the river had crept in, making the world feel distant and surreal. Mark had always loved the eerie stillness that settled over the town on New Year's morning, but this time it felt different. His house sat on the outskirts of town, a modest two-story place tucked at the edge of a forest. It had been in his family for generations, and even though Mark had lived there for years, the house still had an old, almost haunted feel to it. His parents had both passed away a few years ago, and since then, Mark had been the only one left to maintain the property. As he walked through the door, he was greeted by an oppressive silence. It was the kind of quiet that settled into your bones and made the house feel colder than it actually was. The clock in the hallway ticked louder than usual, each second stretching into it felt like a minute. Mark dropped his keys on the side table and wandered into the living room, rubbing his eyes. The house had been empty for a while, but there were always little things that couldn't be explained. Lights flickered when no one was around. Doors creaked open on their own. Once he swore he heard footsteps coming from the attic, but when he checked, the room was empty. Mark had convinced himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, old houses creaked and groaned, right? But that morning, something was different. He went to make himself a cup of coffee, but as he stood in the kitchen, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and for a moment, he thought he heard a faint whisper, a voice too soft to make out. He turned around quickly, but the room was empty. Just the wind, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease. As he waited for the coffee to brew, he glanced out the window into the yard. The fog had thickened, making it difficult to see much of anything, but he could make out the outline of the old shed at the far end of the property. For a split second, he thought he saw movement, just a flicker in the distance like someone had passed by. But when he squinted, the yard was still. His pulse quickened, but he brushed it off. Maybe it was just the fatigue from the night before. The idea that he was imagining things made him feel a little foolish, so he decided to relax and focus on his coffee. After he finished his drink, Mark went upstairs to change out of his clothes. He had planned on taking a nap, but as he passed the hallway mirror, he froze. The reflection staring back at him was his own, but there was something off. For just a brief moment, he saw another figure standing behind him. Faint, almost like a shadow. A woman, dressed in a pale dress, her face obscured by long dark hair. His breath caught in his throat. He whipped around, but the hallway was empty. The air felt heavier now, as if the weight of something unseen was pressing in on him. He ran downstairs to check the front door, thinking maybe someone had entered the house without him hearing. But the door was locked, and there were no signs of anyone being inside. Still shaken, Mark decided to go outside and take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind. As he stepped onto the porch, he heard something, soft, almost imperceptible. A tapping coming from the window above. Slowly, he turned and looked up toward the second-floor window. There, in the fog, he could just make out a figure standing in the window. It was the same woman he had seen in the reflection. She was standing motionless, staring out at him. His stomach twisted, and his first instinct was to run, but something kept him rooted to the spot. The woman in the window didn't move, just stood there, her head tilted slightly, as if she were waiting for him. His heart hammered in his chest as he forced himself to move, rushing inside and locking the door behind him. His mind raced. There had to be an explanation. But the more he tried to rationalize it, the more it felt like the house was closing in on him. Every creak, every whisper seemed louder now, like it was getting closer. Mark bolted upstairs and into the attic. He had to be sure there was no one else in the house. The attic was dusty, filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture. He checked every corner, every shadow, but there was no sign of anyone. No one except for the things his parents had left behind. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A photograph, framed and sitting on top of a dusty chest. Mark didn't recognize it at first. It was a picture of his parents taken years ago, but there was something strange about it. Standing next to them was a woman, her face barely visible, but it was unmistakable. The same woman from the mirror, the same figure in the window. His blood ran cold. His parents had never mentioned her. He had no memory of anyone like her. Who was she, and why was she in the photo? A sudden noise behind him made Mark spin around, but when he looked, there was no one there. Only the oppressive silence. Mark ran downstairs again, his mind racing, but when he reached the bottom, he stopped dead in his tracks. The woman was standing in the hallway, right in front of him. Her long hair hung over her face, her eyes empty and black. She was close enough now that he could see her face clearly, but the terror in her expression was enough to freeze him in place. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply stared at him. Mark backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The house fell silent again. Mark was trembling, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. When he finally found the courage to look around, the woman was gone, vanished, as though she had never been there at all. He left the house that day and never returned. No one ever figured out who the woman was or why she appeared to him on that New Year's Day, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been hiding something that had been waiting for years to be discovered. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snow fell thick and silent that New Year's Eve, blanketing the town in an eerie stillness. Amelia sat by the window of her grandmother's old Victorian house, watching the flakes swirl in the faint glow of the street lamps. The house had been in the family for generations, its walls steeped in history, and according to her grandmother, something else. Amelia never believed in ghosts. She had always brushed off the whispers of strange happenings in the house as the imagination of old, superstitious minds. Her grandmother had passed away in the fall, leaving the house to Amelia. It was her first time staying there alone, and though she told herself she was being ridiculous, she couldn't shake the faint unease that settled in her chest. The creaks of the old house seemed louder that night, the shadows deeper. As the clock struck midnight, Amelia raised her glass of wine to the photograph of her grandmother on the mantel. "Happy New Year, Gran," she whispered. The room felt colder, and for a moment she thought she heard a faint sigh behind her. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. Shrugging it off, she decided to go to bed. Upstairs, the narrow hallway stretched long and dim. The wooden floor groaned beneath her steps. She passed the guest room where the family never stayed, and hesitated. Her grandmother had always kept that door locked, saying it was safer that way. But now it stood ajar, the darkness inside yawning like an open mouth. Amelia's heart skipped, and she quickly averted her eyes, walking faster to her room at the end of the hall. Sleep came fitfully. She dreamed of her grandmother standing at the foot of her bed, her face shadowed. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. When Amelia tried to sit up, her body wouldn't respond, and as if something heavy pressed her into the mattress. The dream dissolved into darkness, and she woke with a start, gasping for air. Her phone's screen glowed dimly on the bedside table. 3:13 a.m. Amelia sat up and ran a hand through her hair, telling herself it was just a dream. But then she heard it, faint footsteps in the hall. Her breath caught. The sound was soft but deliberate, moving slowly toward her door. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She strained to hear more, but the footsteps stopped just outside her room. She wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but fear choked her voice. The door handle jiggled lightly, and then came a single knock, soft, almost polite. Amelia couldn't move. After a long pause, the footsteps retreated, growing fainter, until the house was silent again. She stayed awake until dawn, clutching her phone, but too afraid to call anyone. When morning came, she tried to convince herself it had been her imagination, maybe the house settling in the cold. She went about her day trying to shake the memory, but the unease lingered. That evening, as she sat in the living room, she decided to distract herself by sorting through her grandmother's belongings. Among the stacks of old letters and faded photographs, she found a leather-bound journal. It was her grandmother's handwriting, neat and precise. Flipping through the pages, Amelia found a curious entry dated January 1st, 1953. "I can still hear the footsteps at night. They always come at the same time, just after midnight. I've tried locking the door, but it doesn't seem to matter. It never opens the door, but I can feel it standing there, watching. I've told the children never to go into the guest room, and I keep it locked now. That room is not safe." Amelia's hands trembled as she read. Her grandmother's words were eerily similar to what she had experienced the night before. She wanted to stop reading, but her eyes were drawn to the next entry. "Last night I saw it. It wasn't human, at least, not anymore. It looked like a man at first, standing in the corner of my room. But when it turned, its eyes, they weren't eyes at all, just dark, empty sockets. I don't know what it wants, but it's tied to this house. I feel its presence stronger every New Year's. I've tried to warn the family, but they don't listen." Amelia slammed the journal shut, her breath coming in short gasps. She stared at the guest room door down the hall, the edges of it just visible from where she sat. The unease had grown into a suffocating dread. She decided then and there she wouldn't stay another night in the house. As she packed her bag, she heard the soft creak of a door opening. She froze. Turning slowly, she saw the guest room door was wide open. Her heart pounded as a shadow moved inside. It was slow, deliberate, as if whatever was in there knew she was watching. A cold wind blew through the hallway, though all the windows were closed. Amelia backed away, clutching her bag. "I'm leaving," she said aloud, her voice trembling. "You can have the house. I don't want it." The shadow paused in the doorway, and for a moment she thought it was going to step into the light. But then the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The sound echoed through the house, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Terrified, Amelia ran out of the house into the snow-covered driveway. She didn't stop until she was in her car, driving as fast as the icy roads allowed. She didn't look back at the house, not even once. Amelia never returned. She sold the house a few months later, offering no explanation to the new owners. But every year on New Year's Eve, she dreams of her grandmother standing at the foot of her bed, whispering warnings she still can't hear. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The storm arrived just as Ethan and Clara turned onto the winding road leading to the old lake house. Sheets of rain hammered against the windshield, and the dense forest that surrounded them was swallowed by darkness. The house had belonged to Ethan's family for decades, but it had been abandoned since his great-uncle Edward's death on New Year's Day 15 years ago. No one had spoken of Edward since, and the house had stood empty, locked away like a shameful memory. Ethan had insisted on spending New Year's Eve there, calling it a spontaneous adventure. Clara wasn't thrilled about the idea. Something about the house's history made her skin crawl. But she didn't want to be the one to dampen Ethan's enthusiasm. The house stood at the edge of the frozen lake, its dark silhouette looming against the stormy sky. The windows were black and empty, like watching eyes. When Ethan unlocked the heavy wooden door, a gust of cold air swept past them, as if the house itself were exhaling. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic like rust. They lit a fire in the stone hearth, its flickering light casting long shadows across the walls. The house was eerily quiet, save for the groan of the wind and the occasional creak of the wooden beams. Clara wandered into the study, drawn to the rows of dusty books that lined the shelves. A large, ornate mirror hung above the fireplace. Its surface was tarnished, the reflection dim and warped. As she stood there, she thought she saw movement behind her, just a flicker, like someone passing through the room. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. "Creepy old house vibes getting to you already?" Ethan teased from the doorway. She laughed nervously and brushed it off, but the unease clung to her. They spent the evening playing cards and drinking wine, the fire crackling in the background. As the clock neared midnight, Ethan suggested they explore the rest of the house. Clara hesitated, but didn't want to seem cowardly, so she followed him upstairs. The second floor was darker, colder. The air felt heavier, and the smell of rust was stronger. Ethan opened a door to a bedroom at the end of the hall. Inside, the furniture was covered with white sheets, and the wallpaper had begun to peel. A large armoire stood in the corner, then its door slightly ajar. Ethan crossed the room, drawn to the armoire. "This used to be Uncle Edward's room," he said, pulling the doors open. Inside was an old suit hanging limply in a small box on the floor. Ethan picked it up and blew off the dust. "What's in it?" Clara asked, her voice tight. Let's find out, Ethan replied, flipping the lid open. Inside was an old pocket watch and a stack of faded photographs. Ethan picked up the watch and held it to his ear. Still ticking, he said with a grin. Clara picked up one of the photographs. It showed a group of people standing by the lake, smiling and waving. She flipped it over and read the words scrawled on the back, New Year's Day, 1947. Her stomach twisted as she realized something was wrong with the photo. Everyone had a shadow, but one figure in the group didn't. It was a man standing at the edge, his face partially obscured. His shadow was missing entirely. Ethan, look at this, she said, but when she turned to him, his smile had faded. He was staring at the pocket watch, his eyes wide. It stopped, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He held the watch out to her. The hands were frozen at midnight. A shiver ran down Clara's spine. Then they heard it. A single, deliberate knock echoed through the house. It came from downstairs, reverberating through the walls. Clara and Ethan froze, exchanging a wide-eyed look. Maybe it's the storm, Ethan said, though his voice betrayed his doubt. Clara grabbed his arm. Let's go, she whispered. They crept back down the hall, their footsteps muffled by the threadbare rug. At the bottom of the stairs, the fire had nearly burned out, casting weak, flickering light across the living room. The knock came again, this time from the front door. Ethan moved to open it, but Clara grabbed his wrist. Don't, she hissed. We can't just ignore it, Ethan said, shaking her off. He opened the door. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the porch was empty. The forest beyond was silent, the snow-covered ground undisturbed. There's no one here, he said, closing the door. But as he turned back, his expression changed. His face went pale, and he stepped back. Clara followed his gaze to the mirror in the study. Something was in the reflection. A figure stood behind them, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. Its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides, the fingers twisted. Clara turned sharply, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, as if it had stepped toward them. Ethan grabbed her hand. We're leaving. Now. They rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Ethan pulled and twisted the handle, but it was as if the door had been locked from the outside. The wind howled and the temperature in the house plummeted. Then they heard the sound of footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, the creaking floorboards groaned under the weight of whatever was moving. It stopped at the top of the stairs, just out of sight. Who's there? Ethan called, his voice shaking. The only answer was silence. Clara grabbed a fire poker from the hearth and held it in trembling hands. The footsteps started again, descending the stairs, one by one. A shape emerged from the shadows, tall and skeletal, its head tilting unnaturally as it moved. The figure from the mirror, its face was pale, hollow, and stretched too tight over its skull. Empty eye sockets stared at them, and its mouth opened, revealing a void of darkness. Clara screamed and swung the poker, but it passed through the figure as if it weren't there. It stepped closer, the air around it suffocatingly cold. Ethan grabbed Clara, pulling her toward the study. The back door, he shouted. They ran, but the figure was suddenly in front of them, blocking their path. It reached out with one long, claw-like hand, its fingers brushing Ethan's shoulder. He cried out and dropped to his knees, clutching his chest as if something were crushing him. Ethan, Clara screamed, trying to pull him away, but the figure loomed over him, its gaping mouth widening. In desperation, Clara grabbed the pocket watch from Ethan's pocket and hurled it at the figure. The watch hit the ground and shattered, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The figure let out a guttural, inhuman scream and dissolved into shadows, which were sucked toward the broken watch like smoke into a vortex. Ethan gasped, collapsing to the floor as the oppressive cold lifted. The front door swung open with a deafening creak, revealing the snowy night beyond. Without hesitation, Clara dragged Ethan outside. They didn't stop running until they were back in the car, the engine roaring to life as she sped away from the house. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Ethan stared at the scratches on his shoulder, thin and red but deep enough to sting. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know, but we're never going back." The lake house still stands, but no one stays there on New Year's Eve anymore. Local rumors say that if you pass by at midnight, you can see a shadow in the upstairs window, waiting for the next visitor, foolish enough to enter. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm arrived early on New Year's Eve, burying the small rural town in a thick white blanket. Sylvia and her brother, Ryan, had reluctantly agreed to spend the holiday at their late Aunt Helen's farmhouse, a decision prompted more by practicality than nostalgia. The property needed to be inspected and cleared out before it could be sold, and the new year felt like the right time to let go of the past. Helen had been a recluse in her later years and living alone on the sprawling property for decades until her death the previous January. Family visits had been rare, and Sylvia's memories of the house were hazy and fragmented. Still, she remembered her aunt as kind, but peculiar. Helen had spoken often of keeping them out and respecting the house's rules, cryptic warnings that no one had taken seriously. By the time Sylvia and Ryan arrived, the storm was in full swing, the wind howling through the trees that bordered the property. The farmhouse sat in eerie isolation, its windows glowing faintly against the darkening sky. Ryan muttered something about the place looking like it belonged in a horror movie as they lugged their bags inside. The interior was just Sylvia remembered. Creaky wooden floors, faded wallpaper, and the faint smell of mothballs. What struck her immediately, though, was how cold it was. Even with the old radiator clanking to life, the chill in the air felt unnatural, as though the house itself was reluctant to warm up. "We'll just spend one night, get this over with, and head out in the morning," Ryan said, setting his bag down in the living room. Sylvia nodded, though something about the house made her uneasy. The shadows seemed too long, the silence too heavy. As they worked their way through the house, sorting through boxes and furniture, Sylvia noticed something strange. In almost every room, there were mirrors, large, ornate ones, mounted on walls or propped up in corners. They were old, their surfaces slightly warped, and they seemed out of place in the otherwise simple decor. "Were there always this many mirrors in here?" she asked Ryan, who shrugged. "No idea. Aunt Helen was always into weird stuff." Sylvia didn't press further, but the mirrors unsettled her. Every time she passed one, she felt as though she was being watched. Once, she thought she caught movement out of the corner of her eye, a flicker in the reflection, but when she turned, nothing was there. The hours passed uneventfully, and by the time night fell, they were too exhausted to do much else. Sylvia took the upstairs bedroom, while Ryan stayed downstairs on the couch. The storm outside had grown fiercer, the wind rattling the windows and doors. Sylvia pulled the covers up to her chin, trying to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. At some point in the night, she woke to a soft tapping sound. She lay still, her heart pounding, straining to hear over the storm. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate, like fingernails against glass. It was coming from the mirror across the room. Sylvia's breath hitched as she stared at the mirror. The room was dark, but she could just make out her reflection, or was it? The figure in the mirror was standing, though Sylvia was lying in bed, its head tilted slightly as though it were studying her. A chill ran down her spine, and she reached for her phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light swept over the mirror, but there was nothing there. Just her reflection, lying in bed, wide-eyed and pale. She told herself it had been a trick of her imagination, the result of too little sleep and too much stress. But the tapping continued. It grew louder, more insistent, and now it wasn't just the mirror in her room. She could hear it echoing through the house, from downstairs, from the hallway, from every mirror. A deep, resonant knocking, like someone trying to break through from the other side. "Ryan!" Sylvia shouted, bolting out of bed. She ran into the hallway, her bare feet freezing against the wooden floor. The knocking seemed to follow her, the mirrors vibrating faintly with each strike. Ryan was already at the bottom of the stairs, and holding a flashlight and looking as terrified as she felt. "What the hell is that?" he demanded. "I don't know," Sylvia cried. "The mirrors, they're making noise." As if in response, a deafening crash echoed from the living room. They both froze, and then Ryan sprinted toward the sound, Sylvia close behind. They found the large mirror above the fireplace shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. But the air in the room felt wrong, heavy and charged, as though something had been released. The wind outside howled louder, and suddenly the front door blew open, letting in a blast of icy air. Sylvia slammed it shut, struggling against the force of the wind. When she turned back, Ryan was staring at the fragments of the mirror, his face pale. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Sylvia followed his gaze. Among the shards on the floor, their reflections stared back at them, but the figures in the glass were wrong. Their faces were twisted, their eyes hollow and dark, and they were moving, even though Sylvia and Ryan stood perfectly still. One of the reflections raised a hand and pointed toward the hallway. A moment later, a loud creak came from upstairs, as though someone, or something, was walking across the floorboards. "We need to leave," Sylvia said, her voice trembling. She grabbed Ryan's arm and pulled him toward the door, but no matter how hard they yanked, it wouldn't open. The wind had stopped, and the house had fallen silent except for the faint creaks of movement upstairs. Ryan grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, his hands shaking. "We'll break a window if we have to." But before they could move, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath came out in white puffs, and the lights flickered. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, pooling together into a dark, human-like shape that rose from the shards of the broken mirror. It stood there, motionless, its presence overwhelming. Then it moved, its limbs jerky and unnatural, its head tilting as if it were studying them. The figure stepped closer, and Sylvia could see its face, or rather the lack of one. It was smooth and featureless, a blank slate that somehow radiated malice. Ryan swung the fire poker, but it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The thing raised an arm, and the mirrors in the room began to rattle violently. Sylvia screamed as cracks spiderwebbed across their surfaces, and the distorted reflections inside started to claw at the glass, trying to break free. "Upstairs," Ryan shouted, grabbing Sylvia's hand. They bolted up the stairs, the sound of shattering glass following them. The entire house seemed alive now, groaning and shaking as the entities inside the mirrors grew more desperate. They barricaded themselves in the upstairs bedroom, shoving a dresser against the door. The mirror in the corner rattled, the glass warping as another shadowy figure began to emerge. Sylvia grabbed a heavy lamp and threw it at the mirror, shattering it. The figure let out an ear-piercing shriek before vanishing, but more knocks echoed from the mirrors in the other rooms. "We can't stay here," Ryan yelled. "There has to be a way out." Sylvia's mind raced. Then she remembered something her aunt had said long ago. "Always respect the house's rules." In the chaos, the words came rushing back to her. Helen had always said the mirrors were doors. Sylvia hadn't understood then, but now it made horrifying sense. "The mirrors," Sylvia said. "We have to break all of them." Ryan didn't hesitate. They grabbed whatever they could find, chairs, heavy books, even their shoes, and began smashing every mirror in sight. Each time one shattered, the house seemed to shudder, and the screams of the trapped entities grew louder. Finally, when the last mirror in the hallway was broken, the house fell silent. The air lightened, and the oppressive cold lifted. Sylvia and Ryan stood there, panting, surrounded by shards of glass. The front door creaked open on its own, revealing the snow-covered yard and the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. They didn't speak as they left, their footsteps crunching through the snow. Behind them, the farmhouse loomed, dark and still once more. Sylvia glanced back only once and thought she saw a faint figure in the upstairs window, watching them leave. They never returned, and the house was left to rot, its windows boarded up. Locals say that on New Year's Eve you can still hear tapping from inside, as though something is trying to escape. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The small coastal town of Blackwater Bay was known for its thick fog that rolled in every winter, swallowing the shoreline in a dense, impenetrable gray. On New Year's Eve, the fog was heavier than ever, blanketing the narrow streets and creeping into every corner of the sleepy town. Harper had just moved into a weathered old house on the outskirts of town, a last-minute rental she'd found after her divorce. It was cheap, quiet, and isolated, everything she thought she wanted to start fresh. The house itself was strange. Perched on a cliff overlooking the crashing waves, it had belonged to a fisherman who disappeared decades ago, or so the locals said. Harper didn't care much for small-town gossip, brushing it off as the kind of folklore every old house seemed to carry. Still, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling she got when she walked through the door. The house was cold, and it always seemed too dark, no matter how many lights she turned on. Harper spent the day unpacking and settling in, trying to make the place feel like home. As the hours passed, the storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling and rattling the windows. By the time night fell, she decided to turn in early, her New Year's Eve plans amounting to nothing more than a cup of tea and a good book. Just as she was climbing into bed, she heard it, a faint knock at the front door. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The house was far from town, and she hadn't seen a soul all day. Who would be out here in the middle of a storm? The knock came again, louder this time. Harper wrapped a blanket around herself and cautiously made her way to the front door. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but swirling fog. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. Then, for reasons she couldn't explain, she opened the door. No one was there. Just the fog and the sound of waves crashing far below. Shivering, she shut the door and locked it, blaming her nerves and the eerie atmosphere for her jumpiness. But as she turned to head back upstairs, she noticed something. Wet footprints trailed across the wooden floor, leading from the front door to the kitchen. Harper's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard anyone enter, and there was no way she could have missed someone walking past her. She grabbed the closest thing she could find, a heavy candlestick, and followed the trail. The kitchen was empty, the dim light above the sink casting long shadows across the walls. The footprints stopped in front of the back door, which was locked and bolted from the inside. She checked every room, her heart pounding, but the house was empty. Trying to calm herself, she mopped up the footprints and returned to her bedroom, bolting the door behind her. It was just the storm, she told herself. The wind must have blown the door open and the footprints were hers? She wasn't sure anymore. At midnight, she woke to the sound of voices. Faint and distant at first, they grew louder until it sounded like a crowd was gathered just outside her window. Harper sat up, her pulse racing. The voices weren't speaking. They were chanting, a low rhythmic murmur that sent chills down her spine. She crept to the window and peered out into the fog. At first, she saw nothing. Then, shapes began to emerge, figures moving through the mist, dozens of them. They were indistinct, almost translucent, but she could make out their unnatural, jerky movements. They were coming up the cliffside path, heading straight for the house. Harper stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The chanting grew louder, vibrating through the walls. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal, not even a single bar. The lights flickered, and the room grew impossibly cold. Then the knocking started again. This time, it was at every door, every window, a cacophony of banging that echoed through the house. Harper pressed herself against the bedroom door, her hands shaking as the doorknob began to rattle. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Then came the whisper. Just one word, spoken so close to her ear that she could feel the icy breath against her skin. "Run." Harper screamed and flung the door open. The hallway was dark, the air thick with the smell of salt water. She stumbled down the stairs, her legs weak beneath her. The house seemed to stretch and twist, the walls narrowing and the shadows growing deeper. The front door was just ahead, but when she reached it, the handle wouldn't turn. It was as though the door had fused with the frame. She turned to look behind her and froze. The figures from the fog were inside the house now, their bodies barely solid, their faces blank and featureless. They moved closer, their heads tilting unnaturally as they reached out for her. Harper backed away, her hands scrabbling at the door until her fingers found the lock. With a desperate twist, the door flew open, and Harper stumbled out into the night. The fog swallowed her instantly, the cold biting at her skin. She could still hear the chanting, but now it was all around her, echoing through the mist. She ran blindly, the world a blur of gray and white. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. Her bare feet slipped on the wet grass, and she fell hard, scraping her hands and knees. When she looked up, she saw it. The ocean. She was standing at the edge of the cliff, the waves crashing far below. Behind her, the chanting grew louder, closer. Harper turned, and the figures were there, surrounding her. Their faces began to change, features twisting and warping until they became familiar. She recognized them, the fisherman who had once lived here, his family, others she'd seen in old photos of the town. All of them had drowned off these cliffs. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, her eyes hollow and black, her lips parted, and her voice was a guttural whisper. "Join us!" Harper screamed as icy hands gripped her shoulders, dragging her toward the edge. The fog thickened, swallowing her scream, and then there was only the sound of the waves crashing below. Days later, a search party found her car parked outside the house. The front door was wide open, but there was no sign of Harper. The only thing they found was a trail of wet footprints leading from the cliffs to the house and back again. The house is still there, shrouded in fog, and locals say you can hear the knocking every New Year's Eve. Those who answer the door never return. Story the end.